It's a Tuesday night, or whatever passes for Tuesday when there are no days of the week. You're sitting across the fire from someone you chose, someone you hunted with, someone who kept you warm through a winter that nearly killed both of you. And you're done. Not furious, not broken. Just done. The warmth is gone. The thing that made it work, it's not there anymore. So you do the only sensible thing a person in your situation can do. You leave. No lawyers, no paperwork, no joint savings account to argue over, no apartment lease with both your names on it. You pick up the few things that are yours, and let's be honest, almost everything is yours, and you walk to the other side of the fire, maybe the other side of the camp, maybe a different camp entirely, and that's it. That's the divorce. Here's what's wild. For most of human history, that was the whole process. No court, no judge, no 6-month separation period. And in many ways, brace yourself, it might have been more fair than what we do now. So did ancient humans get divorced? Not the way you'd recognize, but they absolutely broke up. And the way they did it reveals something strange and uncomfortable about the assumptions we've built our entire modern romantic system on top of. Stay with me. This is the good part, the myth of the caveman dragging his mate home. Before we can talk about how they ended relationships, we have to blow up how you think they started. You've seen the image. Big, hairy caveman. Club. Woman being dragged by the hair. It's in cartoons. It's in jokes. It's in the background of basically every lazy prehistoric reference ever made. It is also, to be blunt, complete fiction. Here's the part nobody puts in the textbooks. Hunter-gatherer societies that researchers have actually studied. And there are several living populations whose way of life offers genuine windows into the deep past. They don't work like that. Not even close. In many of these groups, women have significant say in who they pair with. And more importantly, they have the ability to unpair without losing everything they need to survive. Why? Because of one critical fact that changes everything about this conversation. Hunter-gatherer women feed themselves. Not metaphorically. Not in the modern, I have my own career sense. Literally. A woman in a foraging band knows which plants are edible within a day's walk of camp. She knows the season, the terrain, the roots that store through dry months. In many groups, the gathered plant food, primarily collected by women, makes up the majority of the band's calories. Not the dramatic hunt. The quiet, systematic, skilled work of knowing the land. Which means she doesn't need you specifically to eat tomorrow. That changes everything about power. That changes everything about what leaving actually costs. Compare that to, say, medieval Europe, where a woman's access to land, food, shelter, and legal identity was almost entirely routed through her husband. Leaving wasn't just emotionally hard. It was logistically catastrophic. You'd lose your home, your status, your children's inheritance, and in some cases, your legal right to be taken seriously at all. The caveman and his mate, different deal entirely. She could walk. And sometimes, she did. What marriage actually meant back then. Okay, this is where it gets weird, because if we're going to talk about whether they divorced, we need to establish what they were divorcing from. And here's the problem. They probably didn't have marriage the way you're picturing it. Now, pair bonding is genuinely ancient. The tendency for humans to form long-term relationships with specific partners. That's real, it's deep, and it shows up across virtually every human culture ever documented. That part is old. Older than language, probably. But the formal institution of marriage, with witnesses, with ceremony, with legal consequence, that's a different thing. That arrives with complexity, with property, with inheritance, with agriculture, which locked people to specific pieces of land and made the question of who your children's father was suddenly, urgently important for economic reasons. Before all that, in the long era of hunting and gathering, partnership looked more like a recognized arrangement. The band knew you were together. You shared food and resources. You slept in the same space. You raised children cooperatively. That was the relationship. There wasn't really a separate ceremony that elevated it into a different legal category, which means ending it was structurally similar. You stopped being together in the practical, visible ways that made you together in the first place. Here's a dry-wit observation that is also completely accurate. In some ways, they were already operating on the "it's complicated" model. No formal start meant no formal end. Relationships faded in and out of different configurations, partnerships, alliances, separations. with more fluidity than the modern binary of married versus divorced allows for. Several anthropologists who study living forager communities note that serial monogamy, having a sequence of long-term partners across a lifetime, rather than one permanent partner, appears to have deep roots in human behavior. Not because our ancestors were reckless, but because the social and economic mechanisms that lock modern couples together simply didn't exist. Let that sit for a second. How they actually split up. So what did it actually look like? What was the process? Walk through this with me. You're in a band of, let's say, somewhere between 20 and 50 people. These are the people you were born among, the people you hunt with, the people who will help you when you're sick and mourn you when you die. This is your entire social world. Your partner is also in this group. When things go wrong, real things, sustained things, not just a bad week, you have a few options. The first, and probably the most common, is just a gradual unraveling. You stop sleeping in the same space. You stop sharing food preferentially. The visible signals that said we are a unit begin to dissolve, and the band reads it. Nobody announces anything. There's no formal declaration. The structure just shifts. The second is one person moving to a different band. And this was real. Hunter-gatherer bands were not isolated, sealed units. They visited other groups, maintained alliances across distance, traded not just goods but people. Individuals moved between bands for all kinds of reasons: conflict resolution, new partnerships, resource access. Leaving could literally mean joining a different group of people who lived a day's walk away. And the third, and this is the one that feels most surprising from a modern perspective, is that the community itself sometimes had a hand in it. In band-level societies, relationship conflict that destabilized the group was genuinely everyone's problem. If a partnership was creating tension that threatened cooperation, fighting, jealousy that disrupted the hunt, withdrawal that hurt food sharing, elders and other members might weigh in, not in a legal sense, in the "this is affecting all of us and we're going to talk about it" sense, which is, when you think about it, wildly more practical than a courtroom. The community wasn't just a witness, it was a participant. The relationship existed inside a web of social bonds, and the unwinding of it was a social process, not a private legal one. The children question. Here's where it stops being simple, because you can dissolve a partnership between adults with relative flexibility. But children are a different matter, and they were then too. In modern divorce, custody is often the most painful negotiation, because we've built a system where childcare defaults to a single nuclear household, and splitting that household means splitting the child's world in two. But here's the thing about raising children in a band. You were never doing it alone in the first place. Hunter-gatherer childcare is famously distributed. Mothers nurse and carry infants, yes. But older children, aunts, grandmothers, and unrelated band members all participate in feeding, watching, and socializing children to an extent that modern Western families would find almost unrecognizable. Anthropologists have a term for this: cooperative breeding, and it describes a system where the survival of any one child depends on a network, not just two parents. Which means that when a partnership dissolved, the child didn't necessarily lose a parent in the way a modern divorce implies. The father might sleep elsewhere and pair with someone new, but he's still in the band. He still sees the child. He still interacts, still teaches, still exists in the child's daily life. Proximity is built into the social structure. This isn't a utopia pitch. There was still pain. There was still loss. A child whose parents stopped cooperating would feel that. But the catastrophic rupture that modern divorce can produce, where two previously shared worlds split into separate households, separate routines, separate social networks. That specific shape of loss was much harder to create when everyone lived 20 feet from everyone else. Grandmothers, for what it's worth, appear to have been enormously important in this system. There's a whole branch of evolutionary theory, the grandmother hypothesis, that argues older women past reproductive age provided such crucial childcare and food-gathering support that it extended lifespan across the species. They were, in effect, the backup system that made flexible pair bonding survivable. If your parents' arrangement shifted, your grandmother was still there, still feeding you, still knowing where the edible roots were. What this says about us now. Okay, real talk time. We've spent about 10,000 years building legal, economic, and religious infrastructure around the idea that marriage is permanent, or should be, or that leaving requires justification, process, and cost. Some of that infrastructure exists for genuinely good reasons. Property protection, children's legal rights, the economic vulnerability of people, historically mostly women, who left paid work to raise children and then found themselves with nothing when the relationship ended. These are real problems that the institution tried imperfectly to solve. But here's what's interesting. Almost all of those problems are downstream of the very specific conditions that came with settled, agricultural, property-owning life. They are not problems of the human condition in its factory settings. When a woman has independent access to food and resources, she doesn't need the law to protect her exit. When children are embedded in a community network rather than a nuclear unit, separation doesn't require splitting a household in two. When there is no property to divide because nobody owns land, the logistics of leaving are much simpler. Our ancestors didn't have divorce proceedings because they didn't have the conditions that make divorce proceedings necessary. They had something messier and in some ways more honest. Relationships that lasted because they worked and ended when they didn't. Partners who stayed because they wanted to, not because leaving was financially ruinous. And a community that held everyone, adults, children, the person who left, the person who stayed, inside the same social web, regardless of what happened between two people. There's a reason serial monogamy, the pattern of forming deep bonds that can also end and forming new ones, shows up so persistently in human behavior across cultures and across time. It's not a modern failure. It might be closer to our actual nature than we're comfortable admitting. That's not an argument for easy abandonment. It's not a pitch for blowing up your commitments. It's something more uncomfortable than that. It's the observation that the permanence model, the one that says a successful partnership is one that never ends, might be a relatively recent invention. One we attached to a very old biological tendency and then called it universal. Our ancestors ended partnerships. They moved on. They rebuilt. The community held the children. The grandmother gathered the roots. And life continued with all the heartbreak and resilience that implies. 300,000 years later, you're still doing it. Funny how that works. So, did ancient humans get divorced? Not with the paperwork, not with the lawyers, not with the 6-month mandatory waiting period and the mediated custody agreement, but they separated, they walked away, they rebuilt, and they had something we often don't, a community structure that didn't require you to fight for years over assets before you were allowed to stop pretending. What I find most striking about all of this isn't the freedom, it's the continuity. Even after a split, you were still in the same band, still sharing food, still raising children inside the same social web. The relationship ended, but the community didn't. The people stayed. Maybe that's the real thing we lost. Not the ease of leaving, but the guarantee that leaving didn't mean losing everything else at the same time. They separated without exile. They moved on without disappearing. And somewhere in that ancient arrangement, messy and impermanent and deeply human, there's something that still echoes in the part of us that just wants, after everything falls apart, to not be alone. We come from people who stayed in the group, even when they left each other. If you were living in a hunter-gatherer band, do you think you'd stay, or would you walk to a different camp? Tell me in the comments.